Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Boyd. I'm from the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, and I support the Advanced Simulation and Computing Program. I'll be your moderator this morning for the session. I just want to remind everybody that up on the screen over here we'll have announcements throughout the morning. Our first speaker is going to be Rogelio Cardona Rivera from North Carolina State University. He studied in the field of artificial intelligence under R. Michael Young as his advisor. And completed his practicum at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. I'd ask the speakers, and I'll try to remind you again, for the Q&A session, please remember to repeat your questions. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you for saying my name correctly. It's always a point of contention. All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Rogelio Cardona Rivera. I'm a PhD candidate in computer science at NC State University, part of the Liquid Narrative Group. And I'm here to talk to you about my dissertation research, which for this talk I've titled Toward the Holodeck, Computational Models of Narrative in the Relation to Human Cognition. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge everyone who's made this possible, my advisor, Michael Young, and the rest of the Liquid Narrative Group. Go Younglings! Gabe Radvansky over at Notre Dame, Chris Forsyth, Kiran Lakaraju, John Wetzel, and Krell, the CSGF program and its fellows. You all have been an incredible source of support and motivation for me to keep going in this research. So thank you very much. All right, so to begin, I'm going to, without much priming, show you a clip from one of the first experiments on studying apparent emergent behavior. And I don't want to give too much priming, so I'm just going to show it. It's a bit awkward because it's entirely silent. So try not to speak too loud because we'll all hear you. You can laugh, it's okay, it's quite funny. Okay, so this is not a rhetorical question. What just happened? And I'm asking the crowd, could you tell me what happened here? Someone's house got stolen? Okay, that's good. Any other thoughts?
There was some bullying.
Yeah, there was some bullying. Yeah, that big triangle is such a meanie, right? So this is just to demonstrate the power of narrative, right? We're only seeing shapes move about a screen, but it is innately human to kind of layer this narrative over the action that you're seeing. That's a uniquely human trait. And so this is part of what I call narrative intelligence, which is not just understanding the world in terms of stories, but also generating stories. We have a unique understanding for what makes for a good story. So like I said, collectively, comprehension and generation make up narrative intelligence, and one of the points of this talk is to demonstrate why computational modeling is well suited to precisely understand this narrative intelligence through the paradigm of AI, artificial intelligence. So to kind of drive my main point, consider that in third grade, more or less, you likely understood stories in terms of their structure. So Freytag's pyramid is an example of a structuralist account of a story where you understand it in terms of its introduction, its rising action, its climax, its falling action, and its conclusion. So computers do really well with structure. So the key then is to find what data structures do we need to computationally encode narrative. So narrative intelligence comes in two flavors. The first being something more familiar to us all, narrative as a target of interpretation, where we recognize that a film or a book was an intentionally designed narrative artifact, and we get to live in this fictional universe. The other flavor, which we saw at the beginning, is narrative as a framework for sense making. So we're all participating in this annual review narrative, but what you take away will depend on how you weave the narrative web, how you place yourself in that web, and how you relate to the other actors, namely ourselves. And so my subdiscipline then says that computational models of interactive narratives allow us to understand what's common to both areas, both narrative as a target of interpretation and as a framework for sense making. So you may ask yourself, well, what is an interactive narrative? Quite simply, it's an interactive experience in which users influence a dramatic storyline through their actions, typically by assuming some role in a narrative fictional universe. How many Trekkies do I have in the audience? Please raise your... Yes! Awesome. So for those of you who know and for those of you who don't know, this is a picture of the holodeck. This is Commander Riker entering the holodeck. The holodeck is a simulated reality facility in which the actors take part of an ongoing narrative and affect its narrative trajectory. And so this is the holy grail of interactive narrative experiences. And when we've solved interactive narrative, we will have achieved the holodeck, or that's the hope. That's a dying metaphor, but hopefully you can appreciate it. So a key interactive narrative challenge then is trying to get people to follow a specific narrative trajectory. So assume that we have this intended narrative experience where we want the player to start out in the Shire and we want the player at the end to vanquish evil. I hope this is somewhat familiar to you all. Along the way, we want the player to acquire the Ring of Evil and travel to the Evil Mountain, where he or she will destroy the Ring of Evil and thereby vanquish evil. So this is the intended narrative trajectory, and I'm highlighting it in blue here. This is the ideal narrative trajectory from the perspective of the designer. Now the challenge is that along the way, because we have a rich environment, players or participants in this interactive narrative could foresee multiple ways in which the story could go forward. Because we have a rich environment, they could see that there are alternate completions to the story. And so multiple other roles could be afforded. The key challenge is we want to allow some variability, but inevitably we want them to come back to the main narrative fold. And so the question is, well, how do we get the user to understand her role in the development of the interactive narrative? So this is the roadmap for the rest of the presentation. I've already kind of given the vision, so I'm going to cross that out. I'm going to now talk about the data structures that I use to encode narrative structure, as well as talk about my dissertation problem, which is what I call the experiential Goldilocks problem, related to this thing I call narrative affordances. There's a bunch of terminology up here, but this is just mostly for me. We'll go through all this as we go along. Okay, so automated planning and computational models of narrative. This is the paradigm of narratives as plans. So automated planning in the more general field of AI is essentially the computational study of problem solving. For those of you who care about computational complexity, it's P-space complete in general. The input to this problem is a description of the current state of the world, a description of the desired goal state, and a description of the set of actions that are available. So typically, the descriptions are in a formalized language, typically predicate logic. And the planning problem then is to find the sequence of actions that transform the initial state to the goal state. And to give a flavor of how the planning process works, let's go back to the narrative we had at the very beginning. We have, at the start of the narrative, we have the player does not have the ring, and the ultimate goal is that the player vanquish evil. And so a planner will go into the situation and say, well, let me look at my action library and see what actions do I have available to make true the goal of evil being vanquished. And so for convenience, let's say that one such action is, well, the player destroys the ring. But now we have the problem that for this action to execute, we need to establish its own preconditions. And so for convenience, let's assume that one common sense precondition for this is before you can destroy the ring, you need to have it. And so we, for convenience, find another operator in the library. One way you can have the ring is that you pick it up. And now let's assume also that you can execute that pickup action from the initial state. And so there is a plan that solves from the initial conditions to the goal the way that the player can vanquish evil. So in narrative terms, all I've done really is change the labels at the top start and the label at the bottom goal into introduction and conclusion, and I have a very baseline representation of what narrative could be. I've just changed labels. I've not done anything else to the planning process. So the idea is then to borrow this formalism of automated planning, but this leads to some issues, and I'm going to give you a flavor of the kinds of issues that arise, but this is not the main problem I'm trying to solve. It just gives a flavor of what I'm trying to do. So to give an example, this is a story realized in text of a narrative plan being played out. So once upon a time, there was a happy troll. The happy troll had an axe. The happy troll killed himself. The happy troll was dead. The end. Shakespeare, really. So this is an example of an efficient story. We can compute from the initial conditions to the goal condition very efficiently. One way that the player can die is the player kills himself, and the player gets an axe, and so the end. But the problem is then that we can find structurally coherent stories, but that's not necessarily what makes for a good story. We want stories to be believable. We want stories to be interesting. And so the key challenge then is to find ways to expand the baseline planning representation, the knowledge representation, to account for interesting narrative theoretic phenomena. In my case, the phenomena is narrative memory, because I posit that that has a meaningful relationship with how people perceive opportunities for upcoming action. So let's talk about the experiential Goldilocks problem and narrative affordances. I'm going to show you a clip from one of my favorite video games of all time, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and I'm going to narrate as we go along, so you won't be able to hear Skyrim by yourselves. So the key insight here is that in Skyrim, this is a very lush virtual environment in which players could navigate through the environment and face naturally occurring obstacles natural in the Skyrim universe, like cliffs, for example. So typically you want to avoid cliffs. Cliffs are bad. If you fall down a cliff, you will likely hurt yourself or maybe kill yourself in the context of that story or in that game. But let's look at what happens in this particular instance. Oh no, come back. Here we go. Come back. All right. So the player will approach this cliff and notice this precise moment. You get this pop-up that says the Bard's Leap Summit has been discovered. Now, given the timing of that pop-up, how close you are to the cliff, and what that pop-up had in terms of its utterance content, it kind of invites you to think, well, do I have to jump? Something that you wouldn't typically do in an interactive narrative environment. And so the player jumps, and to the player's surprise, there's water that breaks their fall. They do not get injured. And when they leave, they experience interactive narrative content.
Been a long time since someone took the lead. Longer still, since any survived it.
So you can appreciate that this is a humanly designed artifact, and the reason why it's designed like that is because we have an implicit intuition that if something is uttered in this context, it will be somehow relevant to my ongoing gameplay. Otherwise, why would the designers take time to encode that into the game? And so AIs don't have the luxury of common sense reasoning. So that's an example of what my AI would ideally want to achieve. It wants to generate discourse content to prompt and elicit action. The problem is that it can say too little, in which case the narrative is unintelligible, but it can also say too much. Like if it uttered to the player, please jump, then it becomes a chore, right? It's not interesting. It's too prosaic. There's nothing left to the imagination. So the ideal is say just enough and no more. And this is what I call the experiential Goldilocks problem. So in this instance, you can foresee a completion to your interactive narrative trajectory. So once you're at the top of the cliff, you can see how it's going to play out, kind of imagined in your head based on what you experience in the story. I call this concept a narrative affordance. The story has narratively afforded a course of action for you at that time. Now the key insight is that some inferences that you make will be more satisfying than others. And the experiential Goldilocks problem is all about eliciting the right set of inferences. Not just the right content, but the right number. We want the player to have some space in the imagination for other alternate courses of action, but we don't want them to stray too far out. So my approach then is to model the player's reasoning process to inform the generation of utterances. And I do this model is based on plan recognition with this concept of narrative memory. So I argue that players are both problem solvers and plan recognizers. When we consume the story of Goldfinger and we see James Bond tied on the table there, we experience this sense of suspense because we kind of transport ourselves into the narrative and we start anticipating solutions to the narrative problems. And so one of the reasons why we feel suspense is because we can't find a way to solve this problem that James Bond is in, or we can't anticipate where it's going to go next. At the same time, players ascribe intent to the design of the narrative artifact. And so, like in the Skyrim example, you reason, well, why would the designer put this at this moment if it weren't in some way relevant to the ongoing action? And so you kind of try to ascribe intent by finding, well, what's the plan that the designer has in mind for me? So key to this reasoning process, I argue, is this concept of narrative working memory, because it allows you to draw connections between things that are currently salient in your mind or made salient through the utterances of the game. So narrative memory, one model of narrative memory is the event indexing model, which is very compatible with the automated planning model I presented earlier. The idea is that the model assumes as we consume a story, we discretize it into its constituent events, and we tag these events along 5 different dimensions, kind of like the who, what, where, what, when, why. The dimensions that this model looks at are space, time, causality, intentionality, and the entities involved. And I've taken from the earlier planning model the action destroy the ring. We can imagine that the tagging goes like, this is an example tagging. That action takes place at Mount Doom. The index is index 2, which is arbitrary, but just enough to distinguish it from other time indices. Causality, which is on the main causal chain. It's related to the goal of destroying the ring, and it's related to the entities, the player and the ring. And so as part of my work, I co-developed a computational implementation of this cognitive conceptual model, and I developed it in an automated planning context. And so now in my work, I can say, well, given the chronology of events that have transpired thus far, what events are likely to be salient in the mind of the person in the interactive narrative? Because that, I argue, will restrict and constrain the plan recognition process. So just to give a conceptual map of what's going on, let's say that the player is experiencing narrative events and gets to a point where they have to make a choice. At that point, they can foresee maybe 1, 2, 3 possible outcomes that will result from any one of the actions that they decide to take. My reasoning is that if we constrain this by looking at things that are only salient in the mind of the player, let's say that for sake of argument that events 1 and 4 are most salient, it will constrain the predictions that you make going forward. And so it's possible that some projections are no longer compatible with your current mental model, and some projections are restricted in their applicability. And so again, the reasoning is that narrative memory would filter out inferences that are not related to the concepts active in narrative memory. So the algorithm to do this and the experimental validation to see whether this actually happens in humans is still ongoing. But a lot of the exploratory work I've done thus far points to this direction as being reasonable for narrative comprehension, interactive narrative comprehension. Okay, recap. I talked about a lot of things. So that's for your convenience in case you want to ask questions about something that you thought was interesting in the talk. But in general, what I did was I had this automated planning model, which is used in more general AI, and tried to augment it with narrative theoretic principles. In particular, I looked at narrative memory because I think that that will affect how people perceive their ongoing opportunities for action. And with that, I'd like to take questions.